Hmm? Okay, it's start time and we just have an hour, so let's get going. All right, don't give me shit right now. This is the routing area open meeting. If you came here looking for the routing area working group, that's not what this is. It's much like the routing area working group in that it's in the routing area. It's not like the routing area working group in that this is not a working group. This is where your ADs sit up in front and we talk about things related to the routing area. Awesome. So here's our agenda for the day. We have a note taker. Thank you very much. We are going to have working group reports from 3 of our working groups. Jeff Haas has volunteered to talk about lessons learned from working on the EPIC BGP Yang module. And we're going to review quickly high points of the IETF IPR policy. If you had something else you wanted to talk about and want to have it recognized now, speak up. If we have minutes at the end, we'll ask for any other business then as well. Otherwise, on with the show. So just like everybody else, we have a note well. It's the same note well. We'll be noting it even better because, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about BCP 79 toward the end of the meeting. But it's really should be superfluous for us to even have that session because you've all read these BCPs already and are expert in them, right? No, well, because none of us is actually expert in them is why we're having the it's why you're having the session, and it's also why many of you have legal counsel of your own that you should really be talking to if you want to know important details about these, because I am not your lawyer and I never will be. So let's start with introductions and farewells. I guess we have the farewells first. So Alvaro, wave to the people. Thank you. Everyone knows who Alvaro is. I think he's done an epic job. I, for one, am really going to miss him sitting up here in the front with us because people would always throw tomatoes in his direction because they'd gotten most used to him. But I'm really grateful that he's not going far and has already volunteered to do some document reviews in working groups that I've been sitting in with him this week. So really, thank you. I'm John Scudder.
So just want to say thank you, John, and Andrew, of course, and Jim. Good luck, Jim. All this. And yeah, thank you to everyone else because it's been a great few years, 8 years that I sat over there. So it felt a little bit weird coming to the room. But you know, if I look good at any point, it was just because of the work of everyone else in this room. So thank you.
So briefly to introduce ourselves, I'm John Scudder.
I'm Andrew Alston, and thanks all for coming.
And I'm Jim Gishard.
So hopefully everybody has already figured out who their ADs are, but we thought that it would be useful to write this down one more time. Largely, Jim is the new Alvaro. but we did a little bit of shuffling just, to keep things interesting. And that's how the shuffling went. I'm not going to cover this in detail, but it's in the meeting materials if you want to refer to it later. And I think that's the last one for. So next we're going to ask LSR to report. So I don't know, Chris, are you going to talk to these, or is AC? I think. Okay. Awesome. So AC, you're up. If I can remember how to pass the slide control to you, I'm glad to do it.
Okay.
Is there a real working group chair here who can remind me how to pass control to AC?
I don't have that many slides. Maybe it's not.
Okay, I'll just change for you.
Okay. We can I'm going to do a readout on the LSR working group, starting with a brief introduction. The chairs are myself and Chris Hops. We're both working at Lab N, and the secretary is Yingjin Q from FutureWay. Next slide.
I pass the control to you.
Let's see if it works. Oh yeah, fine, works great. Okay, in the LSR working group, which stands for Link State Routing, we work on the IGPs, the interdomain gateway protocols. Those are interior gateway protocols. I mean, those are ISIS, OSPF v2, and OSPF v3. Now, they are specified. There's like a few base documents. ISIS is, as most people know, it's an ISO, International Standards Organization protocol, and that's the basis. There used to be a RFC that talked about that was a base RFC for ISIS, but it was made historic. I don't really have time to go into all the reasons for that. OSPF, the base is RSC 2328, and OSPF v3, it is 5340. Now, both of those, we have a second RFC in which we, given that ISIS is TLV based and neither OSPF v2 nor OSPF v3 were TLV based, we needed extensions. And so in RFC 7684 for OSPF v2, we added additional LSAs with TLVs. Now the problem with that is you have to have two LSAs for a given piece of information, be it a prefix or a link. I mean, a given object in the link state protocol, a prefix or a link. For OSPF v3, we went ahead and we went through the backward compatibility with RFC 8362, and we made OSPF v3 fully extendable. So you get all the benefits of TLV-based extendability, and you can also advertise at any granularity you want, unlike ISIS, where you only have really one granularity, which is the LSP. You can have it as many different types of LSAs as you want, and you can extend them arbitrarily with TLVs. It's really a tragedy that OSPF v3 didn't really catch on as the next gen link state protocol and supplant both ISIS and OSPF v2. I don't know. I guess we were so deployed with the latter two protocols that it was really hard to get everybody to switch. Next slide.
You have the con.
Oh, that's right. It's early for me. So there are 5 quick categories of work that we do on these protocols. The first is base protocol extensions. These are changes to the actual workings of the protocol, either the way that they advertise routes or the way they do the SPF computation, or other internal things, either to improve the operation, the scalability, make things go faster. The second category is what I'd like to call protocol maintenance. This is where we just like advertise one more thing. And as you probably know, if you've come to the LSR working group, we have this ongoing debate on what information should go in the IGP and what should not. But we've, in many cases, we've allowed other routing area, at least other routing area stuff to go into the protocol and be advertised within the ISIS or OSPF routing domains in the IGPs. Now, those are the two kind of foundational categories. And then recently in this readout, in probably for the last 8 years, 10 years, we've been working on segment routing. Those are, extensions to ISIS and OSPF to advertise information needed to set up the MPLS or SRv6 segment routing data planes. In less than 10 years, maybe in the last 5 or 6 years, we've also worked on a flex algorithm, which is an interesting piece of work where we allow one to compute routes based on different metrics other than the OR constraints. And you can do that by prefix without, doing what we do with TE. We do it right in the routing protocol. We do per algorithm computation. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the Yang models. For all these categories, we're working on Yang models, and we've completed our base Yang models just in the last, I think in the last year and a half, they became RFCs. Next slide.
All right, I'm taking back the control from you.
Oh,
There you go.
sorry.
Too late.
I better have a drink of coffee.
I worked
Now,
so
with
hard to figure out how
LSR,
to pass it too.
with LSR, we have a lot of interactions with other routing area working groups. IDR, we have BGPLS, where all the IGP information is carried from a router running both an IGP and BGP, and you can put it into BGP and in a protocol neutral way and advertise it to a controller or something else or another BGP router. In beer, we have beer information, and those, because we have an agreement with the beer working group, those enhancements are actually being done in the beer working group. Spring, of course, I talked about segment routing. Routing working group, there's a lot of the work done there. Naturally involves extensions, small extensions to the IGPs, and there's a lot of work on protection mechanisms. There's a lot of cross review, Yang models and whatnot too. For instance, the routing Yang model was done in routing area, so there's a lot of interaction there. And then for some of the others, recently, PCE, BFD, and MPLS. Remember I said in the protocol maintenance, we advertise information that's not related to the IGPs in the IGPs. And we've done this recently for BFD and PCE and MPLS. And finally, in the past, there was a lot of cross review with CCAMP because all the optical TE mechanisms are based on OSPF. Now we've kind of gotten out of that practice, and we'd let them go on their separate ways and continue to define new extensions to this optical TE advertisement in the LSAs for traffic engineering for optics. Next slide. I'm not going to talk about these, but these are the types of things we do where we actually enhance or improve the protocols. You can see a lot of them. A lot of the recent ones have had to do with ISIS and making it scale better. This is mostly because in most of the a lot of the service providers do use ISIS, and the scaling is pretty important there. I'd like to think that if you would have used OSPF v3, you wouldn't have had as much problem with scaling, but that's probably just my opinion. Next slide. And then we have a lot of this protocol maintenance, where we're just, actually the first one probably should have gone in the base protocol enhancements, where we have, where we advertised additional information in the protocol in order to handle additional use cases. And this is a good portion of our work. Next slide. Won't say anything about this. Okay, next slide. Segment routing. Here are the RFCs and drafts. We're almost done with all the base modifications for the MPLS and SRv6 data planes. Next slide. Flex algorithm. These are the enhancements that I talked about, where we allow separate metrics or separate constraints to be used for different prefixes without essentially doing traffic engineering. Well, really you are doing traffic engineering, but you don't set up tunnels. You're doing it just based on the IP or SR data plane. And we have a few of those. And finally, the Yang models. And as you can see, we finished our base Yang models, RFC 9129 and RFC 9130. And we have more augmentations to handle the work for the other 4 categories of documents that related to the ISIS and OSPF. Any questions?
Cool. Thank you, AC, and thank you for doing that while you were still undercaffeinated. I know that's not easy. Yeah, I'm not really expecting a lot of questions on these because everybody here, by definition, has their own working group to take questions in. But certainly, if you do have questions, you can put yourself in the queue and do it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Haas, reporting for the IDR working group. I think I got a different memo than AC did. I don't have a history lesson for you today. BGP has obviously been around for a very long time, and we get an awful lot of work, way too much work, as our brand new AD, Andrew, had let us know, and as Alvaro, who has patiently suffered through us for many years, also knows. First slide, please. So we met earlier this morning, had a productive meeting, and we're going to have a overflow meeting on the 24th. We made a mistake this IETF in operating under the prior rules of asking only for a single meeting. We typically have enough business to run too. So we'll do a little bit more on the interim. Next slide, please. So IDR is in the process of the rather painful wiki migration, and one of the things that is problematic about the wiki migration for us is that IETF doesn't have other places that are stable references that are easily maintainable aside from the RFC series and internet drafts. And as a consequence, things that we used to go in the documents that are painful and didn't need an RFC number, like implementation reports, got put into the wiki. And we thought we were going to be safe for a few years, and that was clearly not true. So now we're in the middle of trying to make sure that all these pieces of data that were stable are getting moved around. We also try very hard to use it to keep track of our exceedingly large amount of business that we deal with in terms of adopted documents, documents in flight, documents under review, documents working IANA, documents approved and waiting for implementation. So it's going to be a lot of work for us to get things cleaned up. Hopefully we don't have to do this again anytime soon. Next slide, please. So unlike AC, where he's talking about the general flow of things over the last many years for the IGPs, we're mostly going to talk about the themes that we've been working on over the last many months. Hopefully it's a better benefit to the people in the room. If we weren't going through history, we'd be here for a very long time. And we're not even going to cover everything that we're doing because we have way too many things in flight. One of the things that has a lot of attention right now across the IETF is something I call BGP routes with color. This is specifically the classful transport proposal from Juniper and the color-aware routing proposal from Cisco. And the very high-level version of this idea is you probably want routes, especially BGP routes that carry things like next hops that we pass around, like MPLS labeled unicast, to get a differentiator so that you can carry multiple versions of this path. And the thing that we use for associating these things in IETF right now, we call colors. So each of these proposals has a way of actually carrying an endpoint, decorating it with a color, and then a lot of discussion about how that bounces around BGP in the network. Formatting wise, CAR looks an awful lot like labeled unicast with some funny fields. We stuff in extra things. Has a nice advantage that we nicely roll up features like SRv6. CT uses a format that looks an awful lot like our existing L3 VPN routes. People generally look at it and have a sense of what it is. We unfortunately did not have a clean consensus as to which one of these things we're going to adopt. Both of them have slightly different operational paradigms, and each of them makes slightly different situations easier. Due to the lack of consensus, we've adopted both as experimental, and we'll progress each of them for the time being independently. And we'll be defining interop procedures for these things. Next slide. I wish I could say, we've had equivalent to AC slide where we had, dozens of Yang models done and hitting RFC status, because we have one that, the authors of the Yang model have been working on for about 8 years, and we're finally to, about the point where it's working group last call. I find it very likely, without having done the page count, that the BGP Yang module will probably be not only the size of every single IGP Yang model itself, plus probably 1 or 2 other working groups instead. This is just, unfortunately, a consequence of BGP being a very messy, very large protocol, even for so-called base features. We will be looking for people to help us with this review. Please pay attention to this. This was something that I think everybody's going to care about, because especially for features like what the best chairs will end up needing to use for their modules, we will have to integrate. And I'll be talking about lessons we learned about BGP Yang as part of an upcoming presentation. Next slide, please. Another topic that's been an interesting theme the last couple of weeks is dealing with BGP peers that block. And BGP uses TCP as its transport protocol. And from a receiving standpoint, we have a hold timer. We expect to be receiving a steady stream of messages. And if we don't hear from you anytime in some negotiated hold time, we're going to hang up the phone. The session's gone. But what happens if you're trying to send something and it's just simply not accepting the packets, but you're still getting a steady stream the opposite direction? And this can happen for a number of reasons, but mostly it's because in TCP U0 window. There's other circumstances this can happen, and it's for reasons like this that pretty much every BGP developer ends up being at least a low-level expert in terms of how TCP works. Every other protocol in IETF that makes use of TCP is subject to these same considerations, but usually less painfully. So what we have going on in draft discussion right now. There's a draft likely to be adopted, for the PHP send hold timer. Idea that if we're trying to push something and it doesn't go through for long enough, again, we probably want to hang up the session. We've got stale information in the network. This is bad. We also have a submission that attempts to make use of a feature from TCP that's not well implemented, but present in, for example, some Linux stacks. That basically says that if there's a missing X segment that we haven't gotten ACT in a reasonable amount of time, well, this is good enough reason to also hang up the phone. And this doesn't solve the whole problem, but perhaps it's part of the tool set. Please, if you're interested in this topic, join us under interim on the 24th. Next slide, please. We also have a number of features that are going to be getting discussed, dealing with what do you do about information that wants to be very free, wants to pass not only across your AS, but potentially across multiple ASs, even though it normally stuff that you'd want to, BGP procedures-wise, live just within yours. And we have this thing called confederations, which has been around for a very long time. But unfortunately, it's a feature that is not popular, and for many reasons. And in a lot of cases, the cooperating providers that really want their information to be free are part of multiple disjoint actual operating networks. So it's not quite a perfect fit. And there's some discussion about maybe loosening the controls of some of these features among, as one of our well-known people in IETF likes to say, among consenting adults. So we'll be having discussion about what these things mean. Again, let's see you on the 24th. Next slide. What do we do about BGPLS? Aside as some people I'm sure would like to do, say, set it on fire. Well, the answer, unfortunately, is that BGPLS takes up actually a fair amount of traffic and IETF, but it does have an important constituency because it's used as the carrying protocol for multi-IGP domain type features, multi-provider environments. It is a messy protocol that unfortunately is just very useful. And the vast majority of the features are there as parity features for the IGPs. And in those cases, they're fairly easy to do. Problem is LSR isn't interested in picking up even these parity features to drop stuff into their protocol. They're busy enough saying, this exists in ISIS, it should go into SPF2 and back and forth. They don't want to take on a third child that they're not willing to actually feed. So we're likely to see this work considered to be split off in some fashion. There's some discussion going on at this point in time and what that actually means. Process-wise, that probably means a new working group. That said, there's not really enough work with this stuff if it's functioning in a healthy fashion to sustain meetings and such. But it deserves a mailing list. It deserves its participants getting focused attention, and it deserves chairs that are willing to make sure things marshal forward at a good step. So stay tuned for how this works out. Next slide. IDR also deals with the hiccups of its own children and descendants. We have, the BGP enabled services, we have PALs, we have other things like that where, like what do you do when you're using these core features and go forth, propagate, do interesting things, and for God's sake, don't fuck up BGP. And occasionally this does not work out. The problem we end up having is that for the most part, these things should be very core features that can progress in a way that it integrates nicely in the BGP ecosystem. This does work out the vast majority of the time. IETF has succeeded. We're prolific, and now BGP features have spread, solving problems in the industry. Places where we have bumps that occasionally come back to bite us is, changes in the fundamental route selection behaviors. When those sorts of things happen, we can end up with inconsistent route selection. This can cause black holes, loops, all sorts of interesting things. We sadly have one of these things happening, part of a best feature, that's interworking features between eVPN and layer 3 VPNs, and it's a feature called DPath. And right now we're in the process of working with, the document authors that try to rectify these things. This is a frustrating thing because this feature is actually shipped in 4 implementations and can cause, if your route uses this thing inside of a data center, it is now the least preferred route in the internet and potentially may cause routing loops. This is a bad thing. Well, we'll see what we can do. Stay tuned. Next slide. progressing through the publication process, that's maybe interesting for the IETF as a whole. We have this long-lived graceful restart feature, which is valuable for very large service providers running VPN services. It allows them to survive extended outages. Now, this is an important thing. Again, is the children of BGP have gone forth and done interesting things for building up, things that people actually care about for the day-to-day. This should hopefully be through the publication queue soon. Another one of these is the BGPLS base spec itself has gotten a BIS, 7752 BIS. We have individuals such as Ketan who have given far more of their life force to this than ever needs to be done. Hopefully this will be completed soon, and this will be part of the maintenance discussion for BGPLS over the longer term. And we have even small things like a feature for allowing BGP to say, BFD, maybe hang up the phone. This is something that we couldn't tell right now, so this is a feature to let us just simply diagnose the sessions going down a little bit easier. Next slide, please. I am not going to redo this eye chart. This eye chart is here to let you know that even touching the various big theme of things that we have, and this is even harder eye chart. We have a lot of work that is ongoing, adopted, could use your attention if you have interest in specific topics, and includes things like flow spec. It includes segment routing features. It includes core BGP plumbing itself. IDR works just like the rest of the IETF works because people are actually giving their attention, and we appreciate whatever help you can give us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Am I still up?
No, Stefan is talking now.
Hello everyone, so I'm Stefan Mitkowski. I'm the co-chair of the BES working group. So my co-chair is Matthew Bocci from Nokia. I have very few slides. In fact, I wasn't expecting to provide so much detail because you requested only a very short summary in just 5 minutes, but it seems that we have more time, but I can provide more details, and if you have questions, just let me know. So as Jeff pointed, in BES, we like to break BGP in all the ways that we can, just to provide more value to BGP and to service providers and customers. Anyway, so it's a kind of very active working group. You will see what is our, let's say, strategic area. The bad side of the working group, I would say, is that what we have observed in the past meetings is that we always have tons of new individual documents that are coming in, while the group has some issue to really progress the working group documents. So this is something that we are trying to sort out with my co-chair on how we can, I would say, give some incentive to the authors to progress their active working group document. We currently have also some backlog from IESG that IESG need to resolve, so we can as well progress what we have in our queue. So next slide. So the most and biggest topic in BES in these days is EVPN. Okay. We are covering, I would say we are trying to improve many aspects of EVPN. So one of the aspects that we are trying to improve is the base spec of EVPN, so the 7432, and we are working on a BIS version to clarify some aspects, taking into account all the experience from the deployment, and we are almost on the last mile of going to a working group last call for this new version of the specification. So of course, if you are some EVPN user and you think that there are some aspects that are not covered as part of the enhancement of the spec, just let us know as soon as possible so they can be covered. But the authors, I think, have done a very good job on that. So because EVPN is really tied to I would say, end customers and services that they are selling. So there are always new options that we are adding in terms of new types of service interfaces. How do we optimize multicast replication? So multicast replication is a very, very complex topic, and there are very, very few people in the group that are really able to understand what's happening in this area. We are also dealing with interactions between layer 3 VPN and EVPN, because even if EVPNs mean Ethernet, it's also providing layer 3 services. So we need at some point to be able to provide some gateway between the two. And this is, for instance, the purpose of one of the drafts that Jeff mentioned. But we are, which was focused on unicast, but we have also a similar one for multicast. One of the other hot topic in EVPN is how to provide additional load balancing or multi-homing solutions. So for instance, we have some unequal cost load balancing proposal, which is also in the last mile. We have additional multi-homing options. So for instance, port active. The last biggest area in EVPN is DF election. So DF is the designated forwarder when we have this, what we call this bump traffic, so broadcast, unknown, and multicast. So we need to, and when we have multi-homing, we need to elect one guy of the multi-homing set who will do the forwarding. And of course, again, depending on how you want to optimize your distribution, you may want to do some, let's say, statistical load balancing and so on. So there are different strategies on how to elect this DF. And what we see more recently, because EVPN is a very, I would say, a strong technology in the DC area, we have some proposal coming. For instance, there was one proposed this week, which is, for instance, on how to do some first stop security stuff using EVPN by propagating, for instance, DHCP data over BGP. So this is a kind of new area or new stuff within EVPN, which is currently coming. Next slide. Yeah. Intersection with other working groups. So of course, because we are also a BGP working group, most of the interaction today are with IDR. So we already had discussion with the IDR chairs to perform cross reviews of the document. So we have base documents that, of course, requires reviews from IDR, but the opposite way as well, because in fact, today there is not a strong boundary between the two working groups, and there are some drafts that are, let's say, sometime in the middle. So usually we meet together and we decide what is the home, but yeah, there is not always a clear rule. Especially, for instance, I'm mentioning the BGP multicast draft, related drafts, because in fact in BES, we have several experts in some complex BGP multicast procedures, while at the beginning, let's say the base BGP multicast was done in IDR. So sometimes the home of BGP multicast is a bit borderline. So there are some documents that are in BES and some others that are in IDRs. Depending on the draft, we have also we could have some interaction with other working groups. So for instance, when we are working on a BFD for EVPN, so of course we have to work with BFD working group. For multicast stuff, we could have some interaction with PIM. It's more rare, but it happened. An MPLS as well. So for instance, for VLSP ping extension. And we could have also interaction with Spring, because we are also dealing with BGP services that are used by, for instance, a segment routing V6 or and so on. So we are doing some cross review of documents with these working groups. And that's it.
Cool, thank you. And we have Adrian in the queue, and he knows what to do.
Hi, I'm Adrian Farrell. Thank you for this. John, could you flip back to the first of Stefan's slides? So I've got a question. Well, all right, a second. Thank you. A question really, is this, it's about cross review, and is this representative of a timeline for a draft, or is it just like the numbers?
Oh, these are the numbers. Everything which are in the bubbles are numbers of drafts that we have at each
Yeah,
stage.
but the order of the bubbles, is that, and the arrow at the
Almost. I haven't checked if it's completely precise, but almost, I
So
think.
what I'm thinking, as one of these people that periodically likes to try to break BGP by coming to BESS, the IDR review could usefully, like, probably happen twice.
Agree.
Right.
Yeah, this is something that we already discussed with the IDR chairs. Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And Jeff, you're back up.
So as I mentioned, we have a very large Yang module, and it's probably going to be one of the biggest IETF has for a good long time. And unfortunately, it made sense for a lot of very interesting reasons. So part of this was figuring out, what we need to do a module, and especially how do we actually progress this thing. And maybe some of these lessons are useful for other people that's going to be working on Yang. Next slide, please. So this is an agenda. It's also sort of a roadmap and a checklist that people could do as part of their working groups working on Yang modules. These things are, you think very straightforward type operations, same types of things you'd be doing as part of software engineering at any large company. And we fail at a lot of these things in IETF across the board, and we catch them unfortunately very late. So if you could go to the next slide. Part of the problem we have is just simply populating the initial contents of a module. SNMP, especially if you're pulling up stuff from MIBs into Yang modules, you have basically your inspiration for here's sort of baseline what belongs inside of a module. That was hard work for somebody else way back in the day. Finding a way to actually add content, especially for things that are absent from MIBs, is challenging. We had the bonus that the people that originally started the OpenConfig work, they decided originally to try to do this in IETF before they went off to do their own thing. They're still doing their own thing. They originally think that they're going to do it faster, and we find that they're actually not terribly much further ahead of us than IETF is currently operating at the moment. They just have more running code. They just have more running code that's constantly changing. Big problem we have with BGP is in terms of modeling, and this is less of a pain than picking on the IGPs as an example, or PIM, is that the extensions are plentiful, easily as plentiful as some of the other protocol mechanisms, but we have to actually figure out what all these things mean operational content wise. So we started with the idea that we need to have minimally a core set of content. We need to make sure that the structure is correct, especially for things that impact indexing. You don't get a chance to change your indexing without basically replacing stuff in your module. You have to get these things right, and this took a lot of iteration. This unfortunately meant that there was a lot of feature creep going on, and you have to figure out what's going to be core, what's not. This was a hard set of calls, and it's sort of arguable that we didn't do a great job at it, unfortunately. Once this is out, this is a very large module. We're going to end up with more modules that fill out the things that we decided not to do first round. This took a lot of reviews. This took a lot of iterations. A lot of, did we model this right? We'd asked for 2 Yang doctor reviews. We still didn't get it right. We're hopefully there now. The important part is this is a level of continuous introspection. This is not waterfall model. This is very much agile. Next slide, please. Features in terms of what Yang does as a language is a problematic thing. It's basically something that says, this thing can optionally be enabled or present in the model, in the implementation, or used by things querying the model, like netconf. And as a consequence, there are little switches on and off. Is this thing present or not? And they just make things complicated across the board. It's worth avoiding. In the case of OpenConfig, you don't get to use them at all. The case of IETF, we're building stuff IETF wide. We don't have the same rules that we do, for other organizations. We're trying to support what IETF is capable of doing, not what a specific implementation does. So this gives us some flexibility. It also allowed us to just make some decisions. Things like the BGP add paths feature is technically an optional extension, not pervasively deployed, but we couldn't not include it as an idea because it impacted the indexing of things like our routing tables. So, this is an example where looking ahead was very important to get the job right. Assuming that we actually do get our job right, this means that, anything that's not a core piece of functionality can be augmented in later. And the IGP RFCs are clearly an example of that sort of success. Next slide. Maintainability is something you have to have consistently in mind as you're working through this stuff, because you can get it right, it can look perfect, but if the person that's trying to add the next extension can't get their job done, you've got a problem. You have to go back and redo it, and that's highly problematic. So the continuous check is, does this enable future work? Has to happen. This does take some foresight. And we actually did tests as part of things, effectively unit test and integration test, where Mahesh would spend a lot of work saying, okay, well, we're trying to test this features extension. What does a fake module that would use these things look like? Throw it in the integration, we do validation on it, and multiple cases, things were broken. We had to go back and redo it. Had we not done those exercises, then we would have been stuck. These are things the Yang doctors didn't notice the first round. We have to catch these things ourselves. IDR and BES and everything else are adding features all the time that are eventually going to augment these things. So this was a critical step. For protocols that are less extensible or more localized, maybe this isn't a problem, but it's still good wisdom. Probably one of our biggest bit of pains for some of this stuff involves certain types of extensions, for things like our extended community features. This is something you probably recognize from VPN technologies, is things like route targets. In order to actually support those for a core data type, that's maintaining a type def inside of Yang, this is a string, and figuring out how do you maintain the, what will be an ever-growing set of regular expressions that everybody needs to be able to make use of, was a long bit of discussion. It was actually our biggest piece of discussion across the project. And hopefully we got it right. And this brings us, as a related piece, how do we actually manage our types? We have to delegate some of these things up to IANA. If we don't delegate them to IANA, the working group is responsible for basically reopening the work as a BIS, making the changes and reissuing this. And as somebody who, in wearing a different hat in the BFD working group, that got something wrong, it was trivially long, it was easy to fix, and it still took much of a year before it actually republished as an RFC. The penalty is very high. So making sure that we can delegate things so that we don't have to keep coming back to the working group for specific maintenance for base components is critical to allow our throughput. What this means is, in terms of Yang language features, avoid enums. Enums are very handy because they have good tight binding to values, but in many cases use identities. They're effectively numberless, but they're easily to extend. Extended communities is an example of a type def that will require frequent maintenance, and we're going to see flavors of this pop up as problems across future work, which will probably go back to routing working group and all of the VPN service models at some point in the near future. Next slide. And this is the example here. We defined route targets, route origins, and all these things in RFC 8294. They weren't done as IANA maintained. We're going to have to go back to fix these things back to routing working group, probably in conjunction with IDR, to see about making the fixes. We'll have to see if procedure currently allows us to delegate these later into IANA. This will be an interesting conversation for the netmod chairs and such. The problem that we also have is that the format that was defined was a very naive one, which unfortunately doesn't handle scaling across extending the format. It was perfectly fine for the first version of this. The first thing we do for any format is probably going to be wrong. We get to do it again. This is one of these cases. So we're very likely to pick this up as future work for running working group, and we'll be working with the chairs as part of that. Next slide. We also have interesting things for routing in general. This is a modeling question that people get choices at. It's like protocols have bit fields, and Yang does a wonderful job to render these things when you know what they are and what they mean. You can model them different ways. You can use the actual bits type. You can use identities, but identities don't give you a hint as to where the things live in the protocol. Maybe that's not relevant for you. Sometimes that's a perfectly fine representation. IGPs, as an example, make use of identities for a lot of their information. Trouble is, what happens if you're a protocol and you want to actually see, I got a packet that had some flags in it that I don't know what they are. This happens as part of extensibility all the time. And if you're trying to debug things that you think might be related to one of these features for maybe a packet that passes through your system onto something else, you want that visibility. So what do you do about it? Well, the problem is if it's not defined, well, you have to do something about the unknown. There's no such thing as a default for the bits. If you assign a bit name, you can't change it. And we're trying to figure out what to do about that. If you're coming to the NetMod tomorrow, I'll be talking about a methodology for dealing with this, where we have a well-known pattern for unknown bits. Next slide, please. This one's from Mahesh, and it's absolutely true. Examples, examples, more examples. Try the things, actually put things inside of your module, put in things in the appendices, show people how it's intended to be used, make sure it validates with the Yang tools. And if you do all these things, you're half the time going to figure out you're wrong, it's broken, try again. This is unit testing your own stuff and telling people how to actually go about doing the right job. And do it as a complete example, not just snippets. The snippets are where we get things wrong all the time. This was invaluable for letting us get a lot of bugs out of the module early on. And again, these are things that some of them had been around since the first 2 rounds of Yang doctors. We can't, just like with QA, you can't rely on the QA people always finding the bugs. The best thing you can do is unit test. Next slide. Interwork is a thing that we have as a problem across IETF. We're a little bit more subject to some of the problems than some of the other working groups. BGP makes use of policy extensively, and we're a lot of the motivation for some of the things that happen to the IETF policy module. Consequence of that is that things in policy weren't correct, and had we not caught it before it got into RFC, they would have shipped it and they would have had to do it again. Same thing was true for BFD. We had a configuration module for BFD that was used by multiple protocols, including BGP. We got it mostly right, but we only got it mostly right because we did the integration and tried to use it via examples. TCP, very similar. The TCP working group had actually gotten to the point where they thought they were done with their module. They were about ready to hit RFC. We got a sort of last minute request to do review. It was broken. They had to go back and fix things. They hadn't actually tried to use their own model. So it becomes very important as we do these things. Our models don't exist in a vacuum. Test them, make sure they interwork, make sure state that cross-references actually does the right thing. Does it work is a question you have to ask. That is clearly not happening inside of our reviews. This is something that IETF as a whole needs to do better at. Next slide. In terms of actually getting the work done collaboration-wise, we heavily relied on GitHub, mostly worked out of Mahesh's repository. This is prior to the IETF actually coming up with centralized ones. If we didn't have this, we simply would not have gotten our job done in an efficient fashion. We will never have enough eyes on the work for this sort of thing. The number of people that normally care about it is not big enough, and the changes can sometimes be disruptively large. Standard source control for development models, for doing things, helps out. You do your work in small pieces, you get your eyes on individual components of review. You have ideally continuous integration. Mahesh had a wonderful built-in environment where you check out a container, you do all your changes, you can do a make, and you get the draft out that's been validated with the examples. So collaborative environments and the tooling is a big deal. Spend the effort on it in your own working groups. Next slide. Conclusions. Doing the work in shorter period of time would have actually reduced a lot of our pain. The problem we have is just simply that we are all here regularly in these rooms across the planet, but we have our bursts in terms of our cycles. This means that our attention span is not really focused. Doing something that requires this much of a document, working together requires some tight focus. Had we sat down and done this over the course of 3 or 4 months, we probably would have gotten it closer to right a lot sooner. Instead, it stretched over 8 years. Just simply getting the content in the models hard enough. Once you think you got it right, you go away, think about it a little bit, come back, and then it's like, this has been in here for 4 years. It's been broken 4 years. How did this ever work? Well, the answer is it never did work. So the attention becomes very important. You have to get the structure right, ideally first round, but if you don't, getting it right harder and later rounds is harder. The maintainability has to be evaluated, has to be tested, and things have to be handed off to IANA for maintenance in order to make sure that you don't have to keep coming back to a working group. And really back to that point from the prior slide, test against the other things that you're supposed to work with. If you don't interwork, if you don't test things, it probably is broken. And I think that's my slide. Oh, yeah, a couple of GitHub stats. We have over 200 open issues as part of working on things the last couple of years, 135 pull requests, and a lot of this was just simply a lot of not only introspection and comparing against vendor models, but also the OC model that seeded the work to IETF, and a lot of cross comparisons. It won't shock me if a lot of things that we found as part of the last round of stuff eventually makes it way over there. And this proves that collaboration sometimes is indirect as well.
So, thank you very much, Jeff. I see Dhruv is in the line. Please keep it short, though, because we only have 3 minutes left.
Very quickly, Jeff, thank you first for presenting. One question I think which when I joined the queue, I was thinking about GitHub, but you kind of did cover it. What other tools did you guys use to make things a little bit simpler? Like especially where I struggle with continuously changing examples when you put too many and we remodel and then you go back and update everything. So much things have to be done manually. So did you figure out some good ways to even generate examples or any other ideas that you can give us to do this better?
Yep, sort of very tersely. Again, this is just like any other software project. If you check out the repo, which I encourage you to do, you'll see that Mahesh did a very good job of structuring it just like any other software engineering project. We have a make file that builds the examples, the text for the module that was part of the XML is part of one piece of the thing. It has include statements that pull in individual module statements, which are separate files. The examples are separate files. The tooling builds across the entire thing. It doesn't build, the build at the actual IETF draft doesn't succeed unless everything validates. So it's really treating it as just software.
Got it. Thank you. I had one more comment about the INA thing, but I'll take it offline.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Sorry not to have had more time for Q&A because I think this was an important and useful talk. Thank you for doing it. So
I'll be doing it again in NetMon.
Here is a important and hopefully also useful topic, but one that I'm less expert in. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not your lawyer. But we, sort of in recent times in one of our working groups have had seemingly some confusion about what is and isn't allowed with respect to talking about and thinking about IPR. So we thought we'd do a quick review of some of the high points from BCP 79, in particular having to do with what can working groups do, talk about, take under consideration with respect to licensing terms. So RFC 8179 is, of course, the authority on this topic. And it's actually surprisingly readable. I encourage you to read it and not just pretend that you've read it. And there's a number of important sections in it, but Section 7 has a lot of the most relevant information for this topic. And Section 7 leads in with, in general, IETF working groups prefer technologies with no known IPR claims, or for technologies with claims against them, an offer of royalty-free licensing. So I don't want to get into the in general IETF working groups prefer thing. That's not a requirement. Certainly not a requirement that a working group must do this. It's just sort of a general statement of what the authors of 8179 believed was true at that time. But what it does demonstrate is that it's clearly allowed. It's written in our process document. It's not required, but it's allowed for participants to consider things related to licensing terms when they're deciding what to support with respect to a draft. And it's also in scope for working groups to discuss matters related to licensing terms. Now, sometimes people want to spill over from talking about licensing terms, which is oh so interesting, not, to talking about the validity of IPR, because that looks more like engineering, and they can look at that and say, I'm an engineer and I have gone and read this patent and I'm going to talk about how it's a bunch of BS. Pro tip, don't do that. So a lot of, there's a bunch of different text around this, but 7G, I think, pretty much covers it. The IETF can make no actual determination of validity, et cetera, et cetera. It's reasonable that individuals will take these into account, their own views. So what this really comes down to is, in our working group discussions, we do not hold forth on whether the underlying patents that have been disclosed are technically sound, et cetera. And do that at your own risk. I certainly won't be doing that. I'm not your lawyer, but if you feel tempted to do this, talk to your lawyer first. However, what people use as input into making their own decisions is their own business. So what does all this mean about working group procedure? Well, 8179 is a very broad and general framework, and every working group can have its own procedures and its own way of working. But a few reminders. We participate in the IETF as individuals, and each individual, when they're thinking about what a working group is going to do with a draft, what their contribution to the working group consensus is, they should be thinking about each draft as its own thing, on its own merits. And it's entirely possible and feasible that two different drafts in the same working group that have, sort of superficially similar disclosures against them may attract different concerns. Because the way you choose to weigh factors can be complicated. And one example, certainly not the only one, just the first one that came to my mind, is how the licensing terms might affect the uptake of the technology. That's really it. We are 4 minutes over. If I don't see anyone in the queue, so hopefully that means that this is straightforward, and either we don't have anything to say about it, or we're all smart enough not to do it on a recorded session, except for me. So thank you very much for your time, for being here. Thanks to the chairs of the 3 working groups that reported, and to Jeff for his contribution. And of course, thanks again to Alvaro for all of his past service, and future service. So we're done. Thanks all.
Show me.